Hello and welcome to this short video, Temperature Control. My name's Andy Bowles and I'm a food lawyer. Now, this is the 62nd in a series of 100 short videos that I'm recording on UK food law topics. You may be watching this as part of our online training service, which is available at our website. You can see behind me. If you are watching this online, you can see you have access to a whole range of additional resources, including the presentation that's being displayed on the rather wonky screen behind me. And also you'll have access to a webinar, which is about an hour long on this topic, as well as about another 100 webinars and a whole range of other resources. However, if you're watching this on our YouTube channel, you are of course very welcome. Okay, so looking at temperature requirements. In law, temperature requirements are split into two main categories, the food safety ones and product standard ones. Now I've subcategorized them and I decided, well, the best way to do this in 10 minutes or so is to break them down into four main categories. The general requirements set out in hygiene law for food safety purposes, those that apply in approved establishments for food safety purposes. Now, approved establishments are those establishments that are placing products of animal origin on the wholesale market. So they could be things like meat products factories or dairies or something like that. Ships and aircraft. And then lastly, I'll deal with the marketing and product standards requirements. So let's start off with the general requirements. Now, this is a general principle in food safety, and the general requirement in food safety is that unless you have any specific requirements set out in the regulations, and in the UK we have of course devolved administration, so we have different regulations, hygiene regulations in England, Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland. Now in England, Wales and Northern Ireland there are specific temperature control requirements set out in the regulations. In Scotland there are not. So if you don't have specific temperature requirements set out, then there is this general principle that foods that are likely to support the growth of dangerous food poisoning bacteria or the production of their toxins, poisons, they should be kept at temperatures that will not result in the risk to health. That's a general principle. There is also a general requirement that the food chain is maintained. It should not be interrupted. But the cold chain, I'm sorry, I'm talking about rather than food chain, the cold chain is not interrupted. Now with cold chain, obviously you have a manufacturer maybe sending chilled goods by vehicle to a wholesaler who might be then sending them on to a retailer who will then put them on display. There are clearly going to be unavoidable breaks in the cold chain. The law provides for that. So for example, when you're unloading or loading a lorry, or you're stocking a fridge, or the fridge is going through its normal defrost cycle, all of this is provided for. That won't be a breach of law, but as long as the food is not exposed to temperatures that would result in a risk to health. So cooling of food is set out as a general requirements in the hygiene regulations as well. So when you've got food that's going to be served at chilled temperatures, the cooling should be carried out as quickly as possible to a temperature which does not result in a risk to health. So you've got two issues there on cooling, and there is a separate video on cooling of foods. Two issues: one, you cool quickly; secondly, you cool it down to a temperature that's safe. So the cooling of quickly is prescribed simply because, as you may be aware, there are certain food poisoning bacteria that might produce spores whilst they're going through a cooking process. Something like Clostridium perfringens, for example, will produce spores in things like meat stews. If you're making a meat stew, you're heating it up, the bacteria forms a spore, like it's a protective shell around a bacteria whilst it's hot. But as the temperature drops, the bacteria can germinate, they can start growing. So the longer you spend cooling, the more opportunity for bacteria like Clostridium perfringens there is to actually grow out into the food. So you want to cool food as quickly as possible. You want to make sure that food is not kept in the sort of danger zone, body temperature, roughly speaking, for too long to allow other bacteria to proliferate in the food. So there we are, it's a general requirement, but there is a separate video that talks about cooling of food in a bit more detail. So, in England, Northern Ireland and Wales, we have these specific requirements, and they're set out in the food hygiene regulations. And they basically set out food safety rules for chill holding, hot holding, but they allow for both tolerances, so the sort of plus and minuses, but also defences in law if the temperatures set out in the regs are not maintained. So let's have a look at those very briefly. The chilled holding requirements for foods that are likely to support the growth of food poisoning bacteria or formation of toxins, they should be kept at 8 degrees centigrade or below. However, there is a defence. If you've got a food that's outside of that temperature, it's a bit warmer than that, as long as it's not been previously put on service, as long as it is actually on display for sale at the moment, it's not sort of in a storage fridge or something, it's on display, then it can be outside of that temperature control period. It can go above 8 degrees centigrade, but not for more than 4 hours. Now, this was put into the regulations to provide for things like sweet trolleys in restaurants where, in the kitchen they'll put maybe some gâteau or some, chilled foods, desserts that were actually required to be kept at 8 degrees or below. But they'll take them out of the fridge, put them on the dessert trolley, and they're now on display for sale. And as long as they're on display for sale, they haven't been out before, then they can spend up to 4 hours on that trolley. Now, of course, there is this general principle that food should not be exposed to temperatures that's a risk to health. So it should be a managed process. It's a bit of a misunderstanding in the food industry that generally, at retail certainly, that you are allowed to keep food out of temperature control for up to 4 hours. You're not. The law doesn't provide that. The law requires that if the food is capable of supporting growth of food poisoning bacteria or toxins, formation of toxins, it should be kept at 8 degrees centigrade or below. But it allows for a defence. So that means that if you're allowing food to go above 8 degrees centigrade, it must be under a controlled conditions. And that's where you bring your system based on HACCP principles into effect. So, hot holding. Basically, food should be kept hot if it's necessary to prevent the outgrowth of food poisoning bacteria or the formation of their toxins at 63 degrees or above. And again, there is another defence available. So if you've got food on display for sale, as long as it's not been out on display previously, if it's below 63 degrees, so you might have put some hot food out in a carvery for sale, then you can leave it at that temperature for up to 2 hours. Now, the thing about this, again, go back to the general principle. The food must not be exposed to temperatures that would make it unsafe, make it a risk to health. So if you're going to be leaving food outside of temperature control that requires to be kept above 63, then you need to manage that. There needs to be management systems, not just a situation where you just put food out and leave it there. Okay, so there are the general requirements. Now move on to approved establishments. Now, in certain approved establishments, there are very specific rules. The general requirements don't apply. If your establishment has been approved by the local authority or by the Food Standards Agency or Food Standards Scotland, so you're a meat products manufacturer or a dairy, remember, products of animal origin being placed on the wholesale market. If you've been approved, then all of what I've just talked about doesn't apply. However, there are specific requirements that will apply. For example, if you make minced meat and meat preparations. Meat preparations are things like raw burgers, raw sausages, something like that. Then there are very specific temperature requirements that kick in. So, for example, the meat used for poultry must be no more than 4 degrees. If it's offal, no more than 3 degrees centigrade. Other meat, no more than 7. You've got after production, wrapped or packaged, minced meat should be kept at 2 degrees centigrade, 4 degrees centigrade for sausages. So you can see how there are other requirements for things like dairy products and egg products within the regulations. But you can see how they go into very specific detail. Some of the requirements set out in the approved establishments regulation actually apply at retail. So if you sell fresh fish, for example, you're under an obligation to ensure the fresh fish are kept on ice and that the packaged fish is stored at a temperature approaching that of melting ice. So we're talking really getting down to the sort of 0 to 4 degrees, that sort of temperature. Okay, so ships and aircraft. Well, the specific temperature rules that I referred to earlier on, the 8 degrees and the 63 degrees, do not apply in ships and aircraft. The general requirement does apply, so making sure that food is kept at temperatures that does not result in a risk to health. The specific do not apply to permanently moored restaurant ships. We've all moved on to marketing and standards. All of what I've talked about so far are food safety temperature control requirements, but some foods must be kept at certain temperatures in order to be described in a certain way. So in order for eggs to be described as class A, they must not be chilled in premises or plants where the temperature is artificially maintained at less than 5 degrees centigrade, except if they're going to be transported on a chilled vehicle, but no more than 24 hours, or keeping on retail premises for less than 72 hours is acceptable. So you can't chill class A eggs up until the point of retail, except in the circumstances I've described. Also, fresh poultry meat. If you're a retail establishment and you're cutting fresh poultry meat, like a butcher shop, for example, and you're cutting poultry, like chicken, turkey, something like that, on site, then you need to make sure that the temperature does not go between -2 and 8 degrees centigrade if you're going to use the term fresh poultry meat. Okay, well, there's a lot more information on this topic on our webinar, which is available to subscribers to ABC Food Law Online Plus. Thank you for listening to me on this one. There's 1 out of 100, so hopefully you'll join me on the 99 others. Thank you for watching.